Welcome back to EC, where we bring you the latest updates and insights on all things tech and digital. Today, we've got a hot topic on our hands: Meta to test blocking online news in Canada. It's a story that's been making headlines, and we're here to break it all down for you. So, grab your favorite snack and let's dive right in. What's happening? In June, Canada introduced Bill C-18, also known as the Online News Act. This bill shook the digital landscape by mandating that big tech companies, including Google and Meta, compensate Canadian media organizations for hosting their news content on their platforms. Now, here's the twist. Both Google and Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, have decided to take a different route. Instead of paying for hosting, they've chosen to block Canadian news content on their platforms in response to this new law. Meta has already started this process, stating on August 1st that the changes are starting today and will be implemented over the next few weeks. Google, on the other hand, had tested a news block earlier in anticipation of this bill and is considering a similar move, depending on the final regulatory framework. As of now, these are the only two platforms targeted by the government's regulations, but this could change if other social media or search engines gain traction. So, what's the impact of this bill and the tech giants' responses on Canadians? Let's explore. The impact. In essence, Google and Meta have opted to restrict access to news content on their platforms rather than pay for its hosting. This means that Canadians may no longer find Canadian news on Facebook, Instagram, or Google. Instead, audiences will need to seek out news directly from media organizations on their websites, apps, or other platforms. This is because content produced by Canadian news organizations will be blocked by Meta and Google. So, what's the current status of this issue as of September 1st? Let's find out. Bill C-18 explained. First, let's take a closer look at Bill C-18, also known as the Online News Act. This legislation outlines a framework that requires tech giants like Google and Meta to establish agreements with Canadian news sites for compensation when they share journalistic content on their platforms. The goal is to support fair negotiations between digital news intermediaries and the outlets that create the content. This legislation, introduced in 2022, follows a similar approach to Australia's News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code. The Canadian government's aim with this bill is to assist the struggling Canadian news industry, which has seen declining subscriptions and ad revenue as these profits shift to tech giants. While the bill was initially estimated to bring around $329 million to the Canadian news industry, the latest figure from the government is $234 million, with the final compensation subject to change based on how the rules are finalized and whether platforms come to the bargaining table. Now, when will the Online News Act take effect? It's set to be in effect no later than 180 days after receiving royal assent on June 22nd, which means it's on track to be in effect by December 2023. Currently, the federal government is working on creating the regulatory framework for Bill C-18, and on September 1st, the Department of Canadian Heritage released proposed regulations to provide clarity for platforms. According to these proposed regulations, platforms will fall under the Act if they meet specific criteria, including having a total global revenue of $1 billion CAD or more, operating a search engine or social media site in Canada, and having 20 million or more Canadian monthly users. So far, only Meta's Facebook and Google are expected to meet these criteria, but officials are keeping an eye on other platforms that may become eligible as they expand. The CRTC is also conducting consultations on various aspects related to the mandatory bargaining process and other regulations. Now, can platforms apply for an exemption from the bill's requirements? Yes, they can, but it comes at a cost. Instead of engaging in compensation negotiations, Meta and Google could propose alternative supports to the industry. To obtain an exemption, they must sufficiently support the Canadian news marketplace through monetary and non-monetary contributions, estimated to be substantial. fair agreements are expected to align with journalist compensation, the production of news content, protection of journalistic independence, and the inclusion of certain sized collectives representing local, indigenous, and minority community news businesses. So, what's the latest from these tech giants? Well, Meta has made it clear that the proposed regulations won't change their decision to end news availability in Canada, while Google is reviewing the regulations carefully. Now that we've covered the key details, let's talk about where Canadian news will be blocked. Where news will be blocked. Currently, most Canadians can't access Canadian news on Facebook or Instagram, as Meta initiated the process of ending news availability on August 1st. This news block includes links to news articles and multimedia content from Canadian news outlets, making them unavailable to the public. Even news publishers outside of Canada won't be visible to Canadian users. As for Google, if they proceed with removing news access, links to Canadian news will eventually disappear from search, news, and discover products. However, users will still receive SOS alerts in times of emergencies. So, how are news organizations impacted by all this? Those focusing on news delivery are meant to benefit from Bill C-18. However, eligible news businesses are now finding ways to distribute their journalism outside these tech giants' platforms. The legislation defines news businesses as entities operating news outlets in Canada, with their primary purpose being news production. Eligible news businesses must meet specific requirements, such as producing news content of public interest and employing 2 or more journalists in Canada. This suggests that lifestyle magazines and similar publications might not be affected by Google and Meta's blocks.